well as naval movement on the map. Here, each side has a psychological warfare display, so you can place counters to show propaganda, espionage, subversion, sabotage, or counterintelligence, or just have your agents inactive. So you have agent counters for that. Then also here we have industrial cities marked. Now they're all marked on the map. It's you can perhaps just see the sort of the reddish blobs. Those are. I'll zoom in on the map a bit later. Those industrial cities, they're also marked here for ease of use in recording who owns what. So at the beginning, the colour denotes who owns them. So for example, these are Italian, these are Russian, these are German, and yes, just German. These are Austro-Hungarian. These are French, and then the grey ones and some other colours are sort of separate countries, like that's Sofia and that's Constantinople. So apart from being capitals, they're also industrial centres of various powers. So so you have that. You might have noticed some cards just there, but I'll talk about them a bit here. Then we also have substitute counter displays. So you didn't get these sheets, but you got the markers that. Oh no, you did get. I think you did get these sheets with the game. Again, these are paper copies rather than card, and so you have 3 fleet ones, and then these are British, French, Russian, Central Powers. You have the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans. But the Germans, I think, can substitute some of these for like the Ottomans when they join their side. But essentially that's for like hidden movement. And it could also be used, again, to alleviate counter density on the map. But you can see the map is large. So especially within like the Middle East, you're not going to get huge numbers of counters jostling up against each other. Now, I'll just say this is my first game of the whole war, so I'm playing the whole war campaign, but I have played the Eastern Front before, and that I found it very interesting. It really piqued my interest in the game, and so that was a lot of manoeuvre around here, around this region, including a bit of Romania, as well as Hungary and Poland and Russia, parts of Germany, and yeah, yeah, it was interesting. I just say that that's so I've played a little bit of it before. Now, this is just my note for turn 1. Now here we come to the cards. Now, this is not a card-driven game in the normal sense that you think of it. It's more that the cards just represent certain available decisions to the player. So you do not have a deck in which you randomly draw the top cards for any number or whatever and then have to play them throughout your turn. Essentially what happens is the whole deck is yours to choose from. I say the whole deck, but at the start, these are the only ones that are available, plus these. So this is the Entente, and this is the Central Powers decks. Over there, you can't quite see, but about at least the same number of cards again are held back, and they will be released in subsequent years. So 1915, some more cards will come into play, and so forth. And the cards themselves are broken down into 3 types. The first are the front cards. So each of these cards will have an indication if it's playable for the West front. Those are all for the West front. Or East front. There are Middle East front cards. This one's East or West, so you can decide which front to play it on. There's a Middle East one. Now these are all objectives as well. So essentially what that is you say, right, on this front, and you can only play one of these cards per turn, and each turn is a quarter of a year, so a season essentially. You can play one of these cards each turn, each quarter each season per front. So potentially you could play 3 cards for the west, the east, and the Middle East front. You wouldn't necessarily want to do it because they give you benefits but also some risks. So they are objectives, and if you played this one, Race to the Sea, you've actually got no specific objective to obtain. There's no special notes to take into account. There is the historical date of when this kind of event, the Race to the Sea, occurred. Now this indicates that it doesn't come into play any particular year, so it starts right at the beginning. And this means that once it's played, it is always removed from the game. So some will come back, and some have a range on a die roll, like this one will come back into the game on a 5+. So if you go for a Zeppelin stroke Gotha offensive, you might not get you probably won't get a chance to play it again. And this is just the card number, just that each card is numbered. Now what do they do? So one was without special objectives. Apart from the title, what they give you is combat shifts. So no combat shifts on Race to the Sea. The Zeppelin Gotha offensive gives you 2 right combat shifts for air combat. They also give you impulses, and this is all important because essentially each, and maybe I'll move back so we'll get a visual of it, because the visual really helps me at least, and it might help others. And I'll try and go down here and we'll have a look at the turn track. Oops, I got sorry. Okay, so for example, now the turn track includes, it goes from winter of 1914 to autumn of 1919. It actually includes more, like these turns don't come into any scenario as far as I know. There are a hell of a lot of scenarios in the game, which is great. There's 22 of them. But therefore, it says therefore hypothetical situations which players may want to create. But anyway, the Great War starts summer 1914. So you can see that's 1, 2, 3, 4 turns in a year. So you only get 2 turns for the first year, but the first turn is summer, the second turn is autumn. There's some notes here on what happens. There's some combat shifts on the west, east, or Middle East theatre, depending on the weather. So for example, you get 1 to the left, and that is not good. In the Middle East in the summer, it's going to be hot. People don't feel like fighting. I've got there some reinforcements that are coming in for the Austro-Hungarians. And so you note the quarter, and you also note the impulse. So let's go in even closer. So you can see here we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 impulses listed. In autumn, you only get 1 to 3. In spring also, and in winter, you only get 1 to 2 impulses. Now, the first impulse is white, and that is always played, so every turn has 1 impulse. After that, it's up to you. If you played an offensive, for example, Race to the Sea, you would get 2 extra impulses in the west. So then the Central Powers always goes first. They would have their first impulse. Then the Entente would have their first impulse, and then if the Central Powers had played Race to the Sea, they would get 2 more impulses of movement and combat. And if the Entente had not played extra impulses in the west, all they would be able to do is stand back and defend against any attacks made against them. So you can see that makes these cards really critical to the game, and so it's not card driven in the normal sense, but the options that these cards represent do drive the game very powerfully. So you have to, now as I said, you can play 1 of these per front, but you can see this is the starting hand plus what I've already chosen. I've chosen the beginning cards. You don't always get 3 impulses, and like we saw with this one, you can have a Zeppelin raid. You're not likely to ever have that card playable again, so that would be 1 impulse. gone. Now you hear here the Schleifen plan. That gives you a combat bonus, good, and it gives you 3 impulses. So if you've played it in summer, you get all 3 extra impulses. If you played it in autumn, you're going to waste one of those because you can only get 2 extra impulses. But it also has a special requirement. With this, you would discard von Moltke, the Elder plan. So you have an option, and that's actually the option that I chose, which is to go against the East, to try and knock out the East, the Russians, before trying to knock out the French on the West. So you see, this is how the cards drive the game. Not card driven in the sense of you don't know what you're getting, but they drive it in that they represent the options. I can either go west or east. Which plan do I choose? And I can choose at the start of the game, or I can choose to go a bit later, but it would probably be foolish to choose that a year later or in the autumn when you would waste one of the impulses. And then the last thing we need to know is the objectives. So some of them do have written objectives. So for the Schleifen plan, the Germans must capture Paris or destroy a total of 30 intended divisional equivalents. If they do that, they gain 20 morale points. If they don't do that, they lose 20 morale points. Except, as it happens, in the first turn, all morale losses are half in the first turn. So that represents the fact that, the buoyancy, the mood with which each of the nations went to war, back home by Christmas, boys, and all that. And then, but that soon evaporates, and from the second turn onwards, that is your loss or your gain. So you get these benefits, but you have that risk. Now, and you might think, well, you start at 100 morale, so why would you want to go for 20 morale up? Because you can't go higher than 20 morale. Well, because you get morale losses for other cards being played, and also unit losses. There's certain events and things that can be rolled for, which I will get to later. Okay, so let me just see if I can balance this back on here. Okay, sorry about the wiggling around. No, it's not going to balance now. I've taken it off. Okay, never mind. So those were the objective or front cards. Now you have another type of cards called contingency. So again, these are all historical actual things that happened or were likely to happen. Now the objective cards you have to play at the beginning of the turn, so your opponent knows what's coming then. Contingency cards, you can have one of these or one of the others, which are weapons and tactics cards, either or each turn. And you can play these at the beginning of any impulse. So it could be a surprise to your opponent. For example, this card may be played in addition to a campaign card on a front. So you see you get an extra impulse, an extra combat thing. But it's likely you only get that once. Diplomacy. You can make a diplomatic attempt against any one country on the map during the Grand Diplomacy segment. So this is giving you an idea of also how the game, what it includes. An ultimatum attempt. So that is essentially you have to have at least as many units as a neutral power on their border. And if you have double, you get a bonus on the ultimatum attempt, which is a die roll on a table. So, and that never comes back in, is never discarded, or it never comes back into play. I can't remember. But anyway, we can check that. So you can see that's how you can bring neutrals over to you. We'll have to have a look at the table later. And this is peace negotiations. So if both players play peace negotiations, then the game will end in a peace and you assess victory. Now here, raise air doctrine. So you have to spend 10 industrial points, and you're on the 1 to 4 on D6, you have a success, you raise your air doctrine level. That means you get better and or different air units and more options in the air segment. Likewise, 40 industrial points, chance of success to increase, to bring on tank brigades, tank cores, targeting calculators, so you get one right on all naval and air attacks. Now this, okay, so this is in response to Bolsheviks, and that is in response to the Americas situation. So some idea of the flavour in the game. And then here's an example of the weapons and tactics cards. Shock troops. So it costs you industrial, you roll for attempt to success. And so with that cost in industrial points, it's probably not going to happen until later in the game. It's available at the beginning, but was actually only brought into play in winter 1916 by the Central Powers. Okay, so that's an example, and obviously, like I say, there's a lot more, and the Entente have similar Meuse Argonne offensive, Hague offensive, North Sea invasion, etc. And so they have similar contingency and tank and weapons tactics cards. So that's all of that. Now there's one more thing which I need to talk about vis-a-vis the physical components. For that we'll have to go down here. So you saw that this already takes up a huge footprint. I couldn't fit everything. I had to fit that on separate table, although obviously I could have fitted it like in one of these sections. And that's to record rail capacity for the Russians, because every other nation has sort of unlimited rail capacity within certain limits, but the Russians, it diminishes as the war goes on. So then there's this. These are setup sheets. These are fan-made. So you got in the scenario booklet, it gives you the units to set up, where to set them up, but they didn't provide these handy sheets, but you can easily download them from online. I forget where, but you can find them. So this is Germany. This is the starting setup for 1914, and this just helps you to lay them out prior to setting them up on the map. But here what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about the forces, because this is also some of the notability of the game. I'll go more into the notability of the game in another video where I'll take us through the sequence of play. But here I'd just like to have a look at the units. Okay, these are pre-dreadnoughts, battle cruiser, carrier, escorts, submarines, transports, and you do get battleships. But let's have a look at the more regular units. So the first thing to notice, okay, you've got your standard cavalry that you're used to. Now what are these strange symbols? These indicate reserve units. So they are as to be compared with regular units. So sort of the standing army, you've got guards units here. Oh my God, in fact those are guards reserves. So you can see that they're marked reserves, and a lot of them have reserve LW Lutwich or someone. So a lot of them actually have historical designations of 3rd Bavarian. These are corps. You see, so all of these are core units. Even the cavalry are core units. Then you have the headquarters units. So for example, this is the 1st Army. So that's headquarters number 1, and that's the corps they have. They have 4 army corps and 2 reserve corps. And so some armies are smaller than others. Some include cavalry and artillery pieces, and some don't. But so far so good. But it's interesting you have reserve. They're not essentially not really different. It's just a designation, so it's sort of a historical flavour. But then, what do the things say? Let me see. Okay, can't find a pencil. But okay, so you have combats and defence strength, and then you have movement on either side. So the movement of this unit is 2, and the combat and defence strength is 10. Now you can see this is the mobile side, so-called, of the unit. Movement is not huge. This is the First World War. And at this scale, you're not going to create huge sort of sweeping envelopments. They will be slow, steady movements. But then, and before I get to the middle number, I'd just like to flip one of these. What happens when we flip it? Now, this is not a step loss. You'll note immediately there's an E where the movement was. This means it's entrenched. And now the combat factor has gone up to 16. So previously that one was on 8. So it's now doubled. And what that means is this is like the mobile side, and the other side is the entrenched side. Now there's no entrenchment in the first turn, but I think after that any unit can move to the entrenched side. Essentially, it doesn't necessarily mean they've dug a ton of trenches, but it does mean that they've organised themselves for static defence or warfare rather than as a manoeuvre unit. So that's already interesting. You decide at the start of each impulse which stance your units are going to be in, but of course at the end of that impulse they stay in that stance in respect to your enemy. So if these units are on the mobile side, they're going to be able to move, but then they've got half their potential strength if the Intenti fight them and on their turn. But of course, if the Intenti units are moving as well, they're also going to be the same. But if you're moving into contact with Intenti entrenched units, it's going to be quite a different kettle of fish. So that's already one notable and interesting feature of this game. Then the other thing is that middle number. Let's just go to some... So let's have a look at some of the Russian units, just for variety. So you've got Caucasian, Transcaucasian. These ones are anywhere in Russia. We have Siberian units. Now you can see that they have a 2 in the middle and the cavalry have a 1. You've got some air unit at the end there. So 2, their reserve units 2, or in fact 1. Sorry, their reserve units are 1, the middle number. I was looking at the headquarters unit, which their designations are different. So when we go to the French, the middle number is 3. The British, it's 3, and with the Germans it was 3, and then with the so-called minor powers you've got 2s and 1s. Now what that represents is the cadre level. Now the cadre level means if you have a higher cadre level you can move through zones of control of your opponent. So again, this is very interesting. The Russians do not have the fluidity which their German opponent will have, at least the German frontline divisions, not the German reserve divisions. I forget what it means in terms of cavalry in relation to infantry, but we'll get to that as later on. So this I've already set up on the map just to give you some ideas of the units. You've got Italians there. You've got the Serbians, you've got Montenegrins and Albanians, you've got Bulgarians, you've got Romanians, and then you've got the Ottoman Empire, which is stretched out over there. So I haven't set up the Russians, the French, the British, and the Germans yet. And there are units for other powers. Here you've got Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Spain, Switzerland. And I believe there's a few more which don't come on at the start. I showed you some on the off map. So I think that's all I can say in terms of the physical components of the game. I spoke a little bit about the processes and concepts in terms of the cards, and obviously the physical presentation tells us something about that. Let's have a little look at the map, see what we've got on it. So you can see you have clear hexes, rough hexes, and then mountain. Mountain is a bit hard to move through, it's very slow, so you can see that Hungary is quite well protected in that terms, which I found in west and eastern front game that I played. You've got some swamps there. Then you've got industrial cities, regular cities, and then these indicate fortified cities. So, for example, the Austro-Hungarians have got their forts set up, but not so far over here. This line indicates rail network zone. So within that zone, there's basically unlimited rail movement. You can also have strategic movement, and that is a function of the headquarters, their command radius, and proximity to units. And that means you get double movement. So, but you have to stay within the command radius of the headquarters all that time. So you can see that's helpful for those kind of like enveloping and hefty maneuver movements. But you are constrained by headquarters, and headquarters have to have a line of communications stretching along these rail lines. So there, these are all rail lines marked on the map. They're also considered roads for movement purposes. And apart from that, you just have national boundaries, a few rivers, and you've got the sands of Africa here, and forests of Russia over there, and some in Sweden, a few lakes, and so forth. So it's not a cluttered, complicated map, and it was very nice to play around here. You do have the Masurian lakes and so forth depicted. For example, here you've got some blocked hex sides, so you can have those interesting manoeuvres, at least in grand scale. And the last thing I should mention is petroleum and grain hexes, which are obviously important for mobilization, supply and morale purposes. Maybe not obvious, but I'm telling you. And then you have port hexes. Those port hexes are for our major ports, essentially, like this one, where Italians have, in fact, all of their navy situated. So I think I've covered everything that I was hoping to cover at the moment. I'm sure I've forgotten something, but we'll get back to it. Like I say, I'll just give you another look at this without any glare. So you can see you've got major ports, oil, and also industrial centres marked on this map. So you can have troops moving and fighting, I believe, there. I can't remember how it's... No, I don't know how it's simulated because I didn't use that in the scenario that I played. Okay, so that's it for now. I hope this has been informative. If there's anything you want to know about the game specifically, just add it in the comments and I will address it in a later video. So what I'm going to do, like I said, is I'll go through a sequence of play in the next video, and then I'm going to start playing the game, and I'll see what to offer about that, if there's anything particularly interesting or exciting that comes out in there. I think I'll definitely do at least one gameplay video to give you an idea of how a turn plays out in terms of the card play, impulses, entrenched or mobile movement, and so forth. And also to give an example of the play of the naval, and then all the events, the political events, secret agents and things like that. So I hope this has given you an idea of the full scope of this game, physically as well as conceptually. There's a lot in it, and I didn't mention, this is the scenario booklet, so that's separate. So you've got 16 pages of scenarios, and I said how many scenarios there were. There's essentially the main whole shebang, and then every year offers 4 scenarios, one for each season of that year. And they've all got a name related to the historical situation. There's even 1919 scenario. And then this is what I played, The War in the East. So it's a whole campaign game, not just one year or one season, but the whole campaign, but just concentrating on the East. So it included all the mobilization, production, so forth, which I haven't mentioned. And then if I can find it somewhere, is the rule book that, well, I've lost it, and that says something, because for a game this size, the rule book is surprisingly small, and the rules very nicely digestible, nicely presented. Yes, there was that errata that I showed you, but that's more clarifications rather than changes. And yeah, I had no problems with the rules as they were in the Eastern game. In the full game, that I think that there wasn't necessary sort of clarifications to go into it. But that aside, the rulebook, when I find it, is not huge, and presents everything very nicely and explains it well.